Welcome everybody here at Pincher Creek and at the libraries joining us. My name is Samantha. I'm the outreach coordinator at the Pincher Creek Library. This is our last speaker of our winter series. We are very happy to have Scott Murphy he's the fire management officer in Wateron Lakes National Park. He began his fire career in 2001 on an Alberta helitack crew while completing his Bachelor of Science in Forestry at the University of New Brunswick. Upon graduation, Scott worked as a wildfire ranger and then wildfire scientist or science forester for the province of Alberta for several years before a 5-year stint in Parks Canada's National Fire Centre based in Calgary, helping to coordinate fire management activities in national parks all across the country. Scott serves as an operations section chief on one of the Parks Canada's 5 national incident management teams and has worked on fires as small as 1 tree and as big as 250,000 hectares all across Canada, as well as Montana and Oregon in the United States. Scott transferred to Wateron National Park in 2013 and has been leading the fire management program there ever since. Now, every time I introduce a new speaker, I feel like I haven't done enough in my life because these introductions are so elaborate. So I will leave it off to Scott.
All right, thanks, Sam. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. So, as you're probably aware, on September 11th, the Kenow fire burned into Wateron Lakes under extreme conditions, and despite our efforts to contain the fire, spread through the park and out onto neighboring lands, stopping only when there was a change in the weather. So the focus of our talk tonight is on 2 things. First, what happened during the fire, and 2, what were the ecological effects of the fire, and what might renewal look like in the coming years. So I'm going to walk you through the fire chronology from August 30th when it started through to the morning of September 12th. And I'll share some pictures and video with you that'll give you a bit of an insight into what we were seeing and doing and into why the fire was so hard to control. And then I'll pass it on to Kim, and she'll speak to the post-fire effects and to what the future may hold. A quick recap for everybody. 2017 was a very dry season. It was the 3rd driest on record in Waterton, just barely behind 1969 and 2007. And folks here in Pincher Creek will remember 2007 as the last summer before this previous year that the province had to close the Forest Reserve because of elevated fire danger. We had 14 fires in the park in 2017, and all of them, with the exception of the Kenow fire, were extinguished on the day they were discovered, and none of them grew any bigger than basically the size of the crowd here. In June, we only received about half of the precipitation. That's normal for Waterton. So we started to dry out really early, and by early July we were into extreme fire danger, with the crew and helicopter on high alert at the warden office and making regular patrols and looking for new starts. On July 17th, we put on a fire ban in the park, and despite that, we continued to find illegal campfires throughout the park. So on August 9th, we implemented a partial backcountry closure, which is what you see on the map here on the right. So no camping in the backcountry, no fires in the park, and no travel in the backcountry except on designated trails. And the logic there was twofold. Firstly, we were just trying to reduce the chances of new human-caused fires, and the second was for safety. We recognized that the forests were so dry at this point and conditions were becoming so volatile that any new start inside the park, that fire was likely to grow quickly and have the potential to trap folks in the backcountry and put them in harm's way. So we wanted to be able to just focus our attention on the trails that were open and sweep those trails from the ground or from the air and know that we had safely gotten everyone out of harm's way. So as the fire danger creeped up through the summer, we were constantly reevaluating and adjusting our prevention and preparedness in the park. This is a series of satellite photos from the evening of August 30th when the fire started. So we are located there in the middle of that red circle where Alberta, BC, and Montana borders meet. And the white that you see on that map are the tops of clouds seen from the satellites in space. So you will note a large thunder cell that develops over northwest Montana, moves north up the Flathead Valley into our neck of the woods, and it was spitting out lightning and starting new fires as it headed our way. This is a lightning detection map. So through a network of ground-based sensors all across North America, we have the ability to detect lightning strikes hitting the ground in real time. So you see Wateron there in the dark green on the screen, and the Alberta-BC border is that black and white line sort of heading through the middle of the screen. So when a lightning strike hits the ground, one of these circles will blink up on the screen. And I was sitting at my desk the evening of the 30th in the warden office and watching this storm track north and watching these lightning strikes pop up on my screen. And as soon as the weather system had moved on, it was safe to fly, I sent the crew out for a patrol. So they loaded into the helicopter with all their gear in the bucket and headed out on the regular counterclockwise patrol of the park. And as they rounded the north end of the park and were flying down the Alberta-BC border, they looked to the west and saw smoke rising over a distant ridge about the location where that lightning strike is circled. So we send them over to investigate and have a look, and sure enough, we discover a brand new 5-hectare fire burning on the slopes of Kenow Mountain, about 12 kilometers west of the park. So they take these two pictures as they're circling the fire and completing their initial assessment, and these photos help illustrate why, unfortunately, we were not able to put the fire out when it was first discovered. So in this picture, the fire is less than an hour old, and at 5 hectares it is already too big, burning too intensely, and growing too rapidly in steep, remote terrain for a crew and a helicopter to be effective. So I pick up the phone and I called the Southeast Fire Center in Castlegar and talked to the BC Wildfire Service. I pass along the coordinates and we send them these pictures and the crew's assessment. And the crew continues on in their patrol looking for another new start, a new fire from that same storm that perhaps is a little smaller, where they can do something and be effective. So we would have loved to have put this fire out, but unfortunately, from the moment we found it, it was beyond us. And to be clear, Wateron does not have a let burn policy. Wateron's a full suppression park, so we do not let new wildfires burn in Wateron. In Parks Canada, of course, we do recognize that fire plays an important ecological role on the landscape, but our prescribed fire program is how we safely manage for fire on the landscape. We do not let fires burn. We do have agreements in place with our neighboring jurisdictions that allow us to fly into their areas and take action on new starts. And so in the past, we have flown into the Flathead in BC before and put out fires. And we have flown into the Forest Reserve north of the park in Alberta and put out fires. We have put out fires in the Blood Timber Limit out to the east. We have helped put out fires in the MD of Pincher Creek in Carson County. And we have even flown south across the Canada-US border on several occasions in the past, as recent as 2015, and put out fires in Montana in Glacier National Park. So the reason that we did not put this fire out when we first found it was not because we didn't want to, and it's not because we weren't allowed to, it's because we couldn't. At less than an hour old, it was already too big. Burning too intensely and growing too fast. And this is exactly the kind of fire that we were concerned about when we put on that partial backcountry closure. And this is exactly the kind of fire that fire managers all across Western North America had to deal with this summer. And these are the kind of fires, the big fires that we heard about in the news all summer. They all started out as little 5-hectare fires like this one. So this photo gives you a sense of the conditions that we had to deal with on some days. Some days the smoke is so thick that we're not able to see or even get to the fire, let alone drop water or fire retardant or drop off firefighters on the ground. You can see, I'm not sure if it's going to work on the screen. Yes, Mount Blackiston, Mount Cleveland. So those are the two tallest mountains in Wateron Lakes and Glacier National Park, just poking up through the smoke. At this point, this photo was taken on September 5th by an Alberta aircraft that left Pincher Creek and was able to get above the inversion. The fire is about 7,500 hectares. So that is about 10 times the size of Pincher Creek, I believe. And the fire would have taken up a lot of the ground there that you see in the foreground of that picture. But all we can see here is that little plume of smoke where the fire has managed to generate enough heat that it was able to poke up through that inversion. So the take-home message here, I guess, is that aircraft are an incredibly useful tool, but they're not a silver bullet. There are limitations to where, when, and how they can be used. On the other end of the spectrum, when the inversions aren't around and it's a bit more windier, everybody knows how the wind can blow around here. It gets incredibly turbulent back in that country trying to fly around in those in valleys. So the crews and the pilots experience turbulence that's unlike anything you ever had on your worst Air Canada or WestJet flight. And they don't have the luxury of being 30,000 feet off the ground. So when you're working a couple hundred feet off the ground and you take a big bump, the consequences can be fatal. So on the evening of September 2nd, the fire makes a pretty incredible 7-kilometer run to the park boundary and parks itself on the Continental Divide. And if you were around that evening, you would have seen a big plume of smoke pouring across the divide, and we had reports of ash falling in people's yards in the Twin Butte area. And as soon as we saw that run, we knew that our numbers weren't lying and that it really was that hot and dry and volatile in the forest, and that there was potential for the fire to move in similar ways and cover similar distances given similar conditions. And looking ahead in the extended forecast, it was full of days that were similar or worse, so hotter, drier, and windier. And yeah, the forecast was pretty short on any kind of relief. There was certainly no rain in the forecast. So when the smoke clears late the next day, we are able to fly out and determine that there is only one small spot fire in the park. And so if you're following along from the early days, we talked about a ½ hectare spot fire that was in the park. And that is it in that red circle. So to orient you here, this ridge in the foreground, this is the Alberta-BC border, the park boundary, Continental Divide. So BC is on the left, Alberta on the right. This is Upper Twin Lake. And the snowshoe trail runs down this valley, around the corner, and you're into Red Rock Canyon in the Red Rock parking lot. So we get helicopters on that immediately. Luckily we have the lake right there, so it's a pretty quick turnaround time. And they're able to make fairly short work of that. Luckily it was also burning up in pretty sparse fuels up in those rock bands. So it didn't give us too much grief, and they dumped water on that for a day and a half, and that spot fire didn't grow any further than there. Incredible thing to note on this picture is the intensity with which the fire burned as it finished up that 7-kilometer run and hit the divide. This black slope here on the BC side of the border was a fully treed forest, mature forest, and as you can see, there's hardly a green stick left to be seen. So you can imagine what it would have looked like that evening. The number of burning branches and needles and spruce cones and pine cones that would have been being wafted by the fire up into the air and flying through the air across the divide. And again, the fact that we ended up with just that one small spot fire is really a bit of a miracle, and we're just incredibly fortunate and quite glad to see that. So at this point, we have 3 broad objectives, and I'll read them out for you because you can't see them there right now. So the first thing we were trying to do is keep the fire west of the divide. We were going to try and keep that fire on the BC side, and hope that when we woke up and looked at the weather forecast, we'd see some rain out there on the 5th day. Our lives were going to become much more complicated when that fire got across the divide and into the park. Failing that, we were going to try and contain the fire within the park, preferably in the backcountry and far away from infrastructure and people. And lastly, all the while we were preparing for the fire's arrival. So by that I mean we were lining up protection for infrastructure in the park, we were issuing alerts, and our closures were becoming more restrictive and larger, so just minimizing the places in the park where people could be. And lastly, we were looking after what we call business continuity. So we wanted to maintain the ability to operate and carry on with some park business following a worst case scenario, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail. So at this point, the fire has a few likely passing into the park over low tree passes along the divide. So Sage Pass burned out in that initial run. That was that first picture you saw. So we were feeling confident that we weren't going to have any issues there. The next pass to the south was South Kootenay Pass. So that's the star right here. And then further to the south was Akamina Pass right near Cameron Lake. So this is an example of what Keep the Fire West of the Divide looked like. You may recall that after that big run on the 2nd, the winds kind of settled down and were even from the east for a few days, and that's why we ended up with those days with the smoke sitting in the valleys. But we were able to sneak back there a few times through the smoke, and to deal with our problem at South Kootenay Pass, we wanted to use a strategy called a burnout. So in a burnout, we remove all the unburnt fuels between a control line. So in this case, it was the top of the Continental Divide. South Kootenay Pass, and the hot edge of the fire. So the fire was came right down the ridge here and was kind of slung underneath, under the picture. So strategy again, we would come in, we would light our own fire up in the top, and we would slowly walk the fire down the drainage and into the side of the fire where it was growing. We knew that these light winds weren't going to last forever, because they never do around here, but it also said that in the forecast. And we were very confident that when that fire got a west wind on it, it was going to take a big run up that big green ramp, and much the way it did at Sage Pass. And we were not counting on being as lucky this time. We were fully expecting that we would get multiple spot fires across the divide into the park, and that they would begin to spread, and conditions would be so smoky that we might not even be able to detect them or get in there and do anything about it. So this is the fire we lit. We did walk it all the way down, and that operation was successful. The fire never did spread across the divide at South Kootenay Pass, and we didn't have any issues with our fire. This is how we did it. These two pictures in the bottom. We brought a prop for you. Here, that is a dragon egg. It won't hurt you. We use a small machine called a red dragon. We put it in the side door of the helicopter here. And into the red dragon go these little ping pong sized hollow balls. And if you give it a shake, you'll hear a powdered chemical in there. It's potassium permanganate. And those dragon eggs drop through the top of the hopper on the red dragon. And as they're exiting the chute on the bottom, they get injected with glycol, antifreeze. That starts a chemical reaction, creates a lot of heat. And after about 20 seconds, when those dragon eggs are safely on the ground, they burst into flame. And that's how we safely get fire onto the ground over large areas. So contain the fire within the park. So in anticipation of the fire entering the park, we identify strategic locations on the landscape. We're going to attempt to slow down and ideally contain and stop this fire. So those spots that we've identified are all there. That's what all those yellow and blue lines are. And they would represent things like avalanche paths, rock slides, dry creek beds, thin areas, areas in the forest where the vegetation is thinner or sparser, perhaps a spot where the forest changes from pine or spruce forest to an aspen forest. Anything that will give us a little bit of a toehold. Spots where we expect that the fire will either slow down or burn with reduced intensity, and give us a chance to get in there, perhaps do another burnout, perhaps get in there with several helicopters and do some bucketing, and perhaps get in there with the air tankers and run some retardant. We had a few spots that were looking a bit more promising than others, so we invested a bit of extra time and effort into those. And so we cleared out large swaths of trees and vegetation in the forest and set up some big irrigation systems, so some 2.5-inch hose and sprinklers, and that gave us a nice wide wet line through the forest. So we did that here at near the Lynham Trailhead, out here at the mouth of the Blackstone Valley. And then we had a big irrigation and sprinkler line running all the way across the grasslands from the rocky slopes on Bellevue over to the end of the road at Indian Springs, the gravel road that you would take to go in and see the bison. And then we had a sprinkler line that went around the back side of the town site through the fuel break. So again, prepare for the fire's arrival. That was sort of a three-pronged approach, which included protection of infrastructure in the park, again, progressively enlarging and becoming more restrictive on where people could be in the park, eventually putting on alerts. On September 5th, we put on an evacuation alert for the entire park. And on September 8th, we closed the park and did a full evacuation. The third part of that was, again, ensuring business continuity. So the ability to operate following a worst case scenario and provide, at the very least, basic services. On the 6th, we held a community meeting to update residents, business owners, and visitors on the situation in the park. And they basically got the first half of the presentation that you just received. And we reviewed how the fire had grown over the week and filled them in on our planned strategies to contain the fire and protect infrastructure in the park. And then we also gave them a bit of a fire smart primer and reviewed some of the lessons learned from Fort McMurray and talked about why some houses burned there and some didn't, and gave them a little bit of homework, and it was fantastic. They got busy right away. When I left the hall here, I walked out the door and looked across the street, and there was a fellow up on the roof in his flip-flops with a leaf blower blowing out the pine needles on his rain gutters. And people were, moving wood piles, moving furniture off their decks, and all sorts of things like that. So that was fantastic. Again, we're preparing for the worst case scenario. So if the fire overran and destroyed our buildings, we wanted to be able to operate remotely or out of temporary offices until we're able to get back up on our feet. So the MD of Pincher Creek was gracious enough to offer up their council chambers to us. So we moved our emergency operations center into there, and everything important came with us. So I was flying around over the fire, but someone packed up my office for me. All the computers got packed up, the computer servers got packed up, all of our firearms and ammunition. The RCMP were nice enough to store that for us in town. Our mountain rescue equipment all came out of the park. Equipment for handling wildlife. The interpreters even brought all of their costumes and whatnot that they would have used for the programs. So we evacuated like everybody else. The horses even went up the road, up Highway 22 to the Bayou, and the bison herd was rounded up and headed east to Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan. This is the town site fuel break. It was created in the late 80s after the last bad mountain pine beetle infestation in this area. So park managers went in and removed a lot of the trees that had been killed by the beetles. And over the years, we have maintained that. So we continually go in there and remove trees as they die, as well as cut down and remove the new vegetation that is growing up. This is the sprinkler line that went around through that fuel break around the backside of town. So 1,600 meters, that's 1 mile. And it stretched all the way from Cameron Bay around the back of Evergreen Avenue and over to Emerald Bay below the Prince of Wales. We took advantage of those days with the lighter winds and went to some of our more remote locations outside of the town site and burned out some of the grass and shrubs. So we had crews up on top with their pumps and hoses standing guard, and the other folks got busy with their drip torches, just burning out the fuels around them, so if they were overrun by fire, the fire would be just that much further away from everything. The Prince of Wales was identified as a priority. It's a National Historic Site and the largest timber frame building in Alberta, and it is coming up on 100 years old. So a bit of a tinderbox. We had a look at that with the structural fire departments and firefighters, and decided that one of the biggest risks to that was going to be embers landing on the balconies and up in those gables and eaves on that roof line and starting a fire. So through the Provincial Operations Center and Alberta Emergency Management, Parks Canada requested the help of 17 different fire departments came to help us in the end, including these 2 ladder trucks from the Calgary Fire Department. And they can push an incredible amount of water in a short period of time. And the hydrant system in the park would just not have been able to keep up with them long term. So we set up some big irrigation pumps, and they ran water up the hill and supplied those firefighters with water throughout the night. As I mentioned, 17 fire departments, all coming with their own radio equipment and all having their own channels. Very important thing on a fire is that we can talk to each other. So again, through our agreements and partnerships with Alberta Emergency Management, we ordered up some communications techs, and they sent down a few folks with the trucks and this portable repeater, and their sole job was to make sure that every firefighter there had a radio with a fully charged battery and were able to talk to each other at all times. So that was a great help. So on the afternoon of an evening of the 10th, the fire makes a big 5-kilometer move down the Acamina Valley towards Cameron Lake. So all the way from here down to here, one day. On the morning of the 11th, after we give the crews their morning safety briefing and send them off to their tasks for the day, I hop in the helicopter and go out to see what the fire has done overnight. And it hasn't moved too far, but what it has done is spot across the divide and into Tamarack Basin. And so we wake up that morning to a 50-hectare spot fire in Tamarack Basin. And it's quite smoky, but we're able to get a few helicopters in there, and they're able to grab some water out of the nearby lakes and start cooling down the perimeter. But again, 50 hectares, that's about 100 football fields. That's a lot of work to do, and unfortunately, as the winds came up later that morning, it just became too swirly in there and unsafe for them to operate. They called us back and said that unfortunately they were going to have to pull out of that area. So the fire continued to move down the valley towards Cameron Lake that afternoon, and at about 5:30 it entered the park high on the slopes of Mount Rowe at Acamina Pass. It's burning with extreme intensity, as you can see in this picture, and moving at a fairly rapid rate of spread. So this is a video I'm going to play for you that we took. So we'll take you for a helicopter ride. We're over top of basically the Cameron Lake Deus area, the parking lot. So just off the screen to your left here would be Wall Lake and Foran Lake. And then Cameron Lake is just sort of off here on the bottom right of the screen. This is the flank or the side of the fire. So we're going to fly you down the flank of the fire here towards the front, or what we call the head of the fire. And towards the end of the video you will see the Cameron Lake Road or the Acamina Parkway pop into view. So trees in this neck of the woods are 50 to 75 or 100 feet tall, just to give you a sense of scale. So you're looking at flame heights in excess of several hundred feet above the treetops before they disappear into that black column. There's the parkway down below. These little fires out in front, so these are the spot fires that we often talk about. So again, the main fire is just burning trees, and it is breaking off branches and lofting, burning branches, pine cones, embers up into the air, and they get spit out in all directions. So here, you know, we might be seeing spotting distances of 100 or maybe 200 meters. But at other times and other places on the fire, we're seeing spotting distances of several kilometers. So 1, 2 kilometers fairly common, and up to 4 kilometers. And I'll show you that one a little later on. So one more video for you from a little closer up. And again, we're about a quarter mile away from the fire here. And I am sitting beside the bubble, and I can feel the heat on the side of my face. And I have my long sleeve firefighting shirt on, and you can feel the heat on my arm through the door. Just incredibly hot. So here's a series of pictures that will show just how explosive the conditions are. So again, the little spot fires, you can see there's quite a few here. But I want you to keep an eye on this one right here. I'm going to jump you ahead a few minutes. So 5:57, here's 1 minute later. And there's 4 minutes later. So again, keep in mind that the fire started only about a week, 10 days before this. So under very similar conditions. And again, this is why when the forests are this dry and the weather and the fuels and the slopes all align, it can be almost impossible to catch these fires. It's about 8:15. The aircraft are down for the night now because they can't fly in the dark. And so we sent them all to Pincher Creek along with the big D-train fuel tanker because we're worried about everything being smoked in Waterton in the morning, not being able to fly. So we move everything out to the airport, and to get a sense of where the fire is, take a drive up the Cameron Lake Road at about 8:15, and just a kilometer or two past the first oil well site in Western Canada, National Historic Site. I bump into the fire here. And so I'll play this one for you. I step out of the car and you can see the yellow line on the road. So this is right on the Cameron Lake Road. Cameron Creek is right about here. So the fire is burning down in the creek, across and starting up Buchanan Ridge on the other side.
I'd like you to go somewhere else, please.
Yeah. That's what the guy driving the car said. He said, "Get in, it's time to go." At about 9 o'clock, we get our first glimpse of the fire from the town site. So this picture is taken from a balcony at the Bayshore Inn, looking down the drag. So here's Pat's, the gas station. The Park and Min building is right about here. And then the Bear's Hump is hiding up here in the dark to the right. So we're looking straight down, or straight up the valley past that switchback close to Cameron Lake. And we see the first hint of fire. So just a series of pictures here, I'll just flick through somewhat quickly, that give you a sense of what it looked like in the town site that night over the next few hours. So as the fire was approaching town, this picture was taken by the crews up at the Prince of Wales. You can see the silhouette of the Bear's Hump here, and the fire just coming to the mouth of the valley. This was taken on the lawn of just south of the community center, looking down the street as the fire back down the slopes of Bertha Peak. So Cameron Falls would be right about here at the end of the road. This was taken from the marina at about 12:30 in the morning. You can see the fire has burned past the warden office and compound on the slopes. You can see snags up there still glowing on the side of the mountain, and fire is burning on the back 3 sides around the Prince of Wales. This is one of the aerial trucks up the Prince of Wales, fully extended, trying to push those flames back down the hill. Another shot from over by the Prince of Wales and those crews looking across over top of the visitor center onto the slopes of Crandall Mountain. And there's the Bear's Hump up in the smoke. And I think this is my last one. Again, this is standing on the lawn. The field there in front of the community center by the lodge and the United Church, looking up on the slopes of Bertha Peak as it back down towards the fuel break and that sprinkler line. So that night the fire moved through the park at a pretty high rate of spread, clearly. It entered the park at about 5:30 p.m. as you saw in that video. It was taken right here. And by 10:30 p.m. it was out the other side. So it covered a distance of around 20 kilometers in 4 or 5 hours. Yeah, the fire burned down the Cameron Valley and made the corner and came to town, as you saw in those pictures. Then it also went out over Crandall Lake and wrapped around the backside of Crandall Mountain and sent spot fires out into the grasslands here to the east. And then that spot fire that had been up in the Tamarack Basin, at about the same time it was making its way down the Blackstone Valley through Red Rock Canyon and yeah, out past Crandall Campground. Fire spread up the slopes of Galway. There was a pine stand there that gave it an easy path into Horseshoe Basin, and then yeah, fire exited the park to the northeast. So just as things are starting to get busy in the town site and preparations there were ramping up, we got a report of a spot fire out by the park gate. So we sent some crews out to try and contain it inside the park. This is a video, another video I'm going to play for you. It was taken by some non-firefighting staff who were leaving that park and heading to Pincher Creek for the night at that point. And what I want you to get out of this is just a sense that there are multiple and separate fires burning out there in the grasslands between Crandall Mountain and the park gate. So this is the backside of Crandall Mountain here, sort of above the golf course as it comes around the corner. The mouth of the valley is over and about here. Some of those stands out in the middle of the Escrin would appear to be on fire. And then we have this spot fire that's right up against the road. As they're making the drive out, one of the staff also reports looking across Lower Wateron Lake over by the site of the old Y camp where the cabins were, and they're seeing fire over on the far side of the lake as well. So at about 9:30, this is the situation that we're faced with. The fire has burned down this valley into the town, and it's wrapping around Crandall. That's the fire you saw at the beginning of the video. Here's the one that was out in those stands in the middle of the grasslands, the Badlands of the Escrin. Here's the last one you saw in that video right beside the road. Then we had the fire that was taken out by the park gates, that first one I showed you. And then we had the spot fire that was reported across the lake over at the Y camp. So the strategy at this point was to try and corral the fire between the entrance road, Highway 6, the gravel road going into the paddock, and our sprinkler line that ran all the way back to Bellevue. So the crews met at the Knights Lake Days area and formulated a plan, assessed the conditions, and decided it was safe to attempt the burnout. So one of the crews went to the north end at Indian Springs at the dead end gravel road, and the other crew stayed at Knights Lake Davis area. And they were going to attempt a burnout. So same sort of strategy as we tried at South Kootenai Pass, but different scale and no helicopters because we're at night now. Unfortunately, they just get started. The extent of what they were able to light is what you see there in red. When one of the wardens who was coming down to assist with the situation from Pincher Creek came flying down Highway 6 here from the north and bumped in to the wildfire crossing Highway 6. He drove right through the fire on both sides. He was going so fast he didn't have time to get stopped. He gets on the radio and lets us know that we have fire on both sides of the road. It's across the highway and it's headed east. And at that point, the crews have to report the mission. They retreat to safety here at the north end, and then they, along with the wardens and RCMP, begin door-to-door evacuations on the neighbors outside the park. Here are a couple of pictures of their work. So the one on the left is taken of the crew that started near the Knights Lake Davis area. So this median right here is by the kiosks where you pay for your pass on the way into the gate, and we're looking back into the park. So they started just here behind the truck with their drip torches lighting up the ditch, and you can see their fire here starting up the hill towards that one you saw in the first picture, the 930 picture, and that's their fire continues along to here, and that's as far as they got before they got the call from the warden. So they didn't even make it to the park gate, unfortunately. Oh, back it up. Picture on the right, a little harder to see here right now, but you're looking over the firefighter's shoulder, looking west, and he's standing on the gravel road there that heads down to Indian Springs. You can pick out the big tall posts here. Those are the tall steel posts on the bison paddock enclosure. And so again, just with the drip torch lighting up the grass on the south side of the road, and headed east towards Highway 6 to meet up with the other crew. And the interesting thing about this picture on the right is that despite the fact that we had fairly moderate winds out of the south and southwest that evening, you can see that the smoke from their fire is not blowing north across the road, and the flames from their fire are not leaning north across the road. And that's a function of the draw off the fire that's burning across the grasslands and is pulling the fire that they had lit back in. Just incredible forces at play. Finally, on the morning of the 12th, we get the change in the weather that we've been waiting for. The wind direction and speed become more favorable, and the humidities climb well out of the teens. So the times there, it'd be hard to read from the back, but I've got circled between 5 and 7 a.m. on the morning of the 12th. So between 6 and 7, the temperature drops from 16 degrees to 12 degrees, and the humidity doubles from 33% to 66%. And at midnight, it had been as low as 23 degrees, and the humidity was only 16%. The winds have switched direction and are now blowing out of the north, and the fire is basically pushing back on itself. So this picture is taken from the junction of Oil Basin Road and Highway 6, looking west that morning, and yeah, you can see the smoke leaning to the north back into the park. It never does dry out again, and rain is finally on the way by the 13th. So, to wrap things up before I pass them off to Kim, this is my presentation in one slide. It was a historically dry year. It was historically dry in Waterton, but it was historically dry all across western North America. We had a fire start west of the park. It quickly grew beyond any chance of initial attack, you know, as many fires did this year. We worked hard to keep the fire west of the divide as the conditions would allow us to work, with helicopter buckets, air tankers, and burnouts. And we figured that, you know, that burnout at South Kootenay Pass probably bought us at least 2 days of preparation time. We pre-identified strategic spots on the landscape where we had hoped to contain the fire, you know, using natural features, fire guards and sprinkler lines, you know, all the while preparing for the possibility that we might be entirely overrun by the fire. And unfortunately, on the 11th, we were faced with the worst case scenario. The fire was critically dry, we had high temperatures, low humidities, it was windy, and the fire came at night. And in the end, as is often the case with these big fires, it was a change in the weather that made the difference and allowed us to bring it under control. So that is it for my part of the presentation. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everybody who was involved in the fire, folks from the neighboring agencies, the MD, Pincher Creek, Carson, and the town, Alberta Forestry, Alberta Emergency Management, all the 17 firefighting crews that came from across southern Alberta to help us out in our time of need, as well as the folks in the community who were incredibly supportive and passed on many well wishes, and that means a lot to the folks who are out there in the trenches. So thank you to everybody, and with that I lied, I have one more slide and then I'm going to pass it off to Kim. Sorry, Sam.
No.
So just to give you a sense of how big a 35,000 hectare fire is, that was the final size of the Kenow fire. It didn't grow in any appreciable measure after that morning of the 12th. 35,000 hectares, that is overlaid on a map of the city of Calgary. So you can see it stretches all the way from the west side to the east side of Calgary and takes up a good chunk of the north to the south. The Lost Creek fire in the Crow's Nest Pass in 2003, if you remember that one, that was about 22,000 hectares. So a little bit bigger this time around. Okay, thank you.
Am I in your right?
No, you're good, yeah.
Okay, while Kim's getting ready, I'm going to introduce her now. Kim Pearson has been a resident of the Wateron area since 1997. She studied conservation biology at the Universities of Alberta and Lethbridge. For a decade, she managed the Nature Conservancy, tongue-tied, of Canada, the Waterton Parkfront project, which she has presented on as part of this speaker series. Since 2014, she's managed a project focused on improving grassland health in Waterton Lakes National Park. The Kenow wildfire has affected virtually every aspect of her colleagues' work. She will share an overview of the fire's ecological effects within the park. So, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much to the Pincher Creek Library for having Scott and I. We really appreciate the opportunity to come speak to the community about the Kenow wildfire and its ecological effects as well. Alright, so as and Scott mentioned, I'm here to present to you on the ecological effects of the Kenow wildfire, so what's going on in the park now and moving forward. And it's a bit of a challenge to cover the breadth of the ecological effects of this fire in just a short time, but it is an overview. Keep that in mind. There's a lot more to it than just what I'm presenting on here. So before I get into the effects of the wildfire on an ecological level, I just want to first acknowledge quickly on behalf of Parks Canada that our communities were affected at quite a visceral level by this rather traumatic event. That's a look, just a quick couple of looks at the fire. The Kenow wildfire's impacts on the landscape have posed challenges that are physical, such as rebuilding damaged and destroyed infrastructure, and also the impacts can be a challenge to process at an emotional level, and they likely will be for quite some time. And with these tangible impacts in mind, as well as the resilience of our human communities, I'll focus on the ecological resilience that we can expect to see take place. And I'll be speaking specifically to the ecology of Waterton Lakes National Park. However, similar considerations could be applied to lands outside of park boundaries within Alberta and BC. So I have three primary messages. First, the Kenow wildfire has caused many extreme ecological changes to take place. Looking ahead, ecological renewal will take place. Nature is resilient and has renewed itself following disturbances such as this many times over on this same landscape. And lastly, ecological renewal following this wildfire may well be beyond the scope of our lifetimes, and it may look very different than we've become accustomed to. However, the coming years will bring with them the opportunity to witness the foundations of nature's reconstruction plans. So now let's explore those points together in more depth, beginning with fire severity. So the definition of fire severity is in a basic level. It's quite complex when you really go out and measure it, but fire severity is a fire's impacts on organic matter above and below ground. So essentially a loss of vegetation and soils that's taken place as a result of a fire. So it's measured using a 4-category scale. And I'll go through that quickly here. So here's an example. Some of these photos are not from Waterton, I should note. Yeah, there aren't a lot of low severity sites to find photos of in Waterton right now. We'll get to that in a moment, but we haven't had an opportunity to gather them yet. So I'm going to use examples here from forests, but similar principles do apply for grassland areas. So low severity stand for forests that have been affected by fire have scorched or lightly charred surfaces, but substantial organic matter still exists. Up to 50% of the litter from the ground, the dead vegetation, has been removed, and up to 10% of the canopy of the forest has been removed in the overstory. But generally, soil microbes and organisms are intact. So moving on to moderate severity. Moderate severity forest stands have charred surfaces with 100% of the litter on the ground having been removed. Some exposed mineral soil and ash may be present, and overstory tree mortality is more common at these sites, with about half of the canopy removed and some branches and foliage still remaining. High severity stands, this was taken at Fort McMurray, have surfaces composed mainly of mineral soil or ash, and about 70% of the overstory tree canopy has been removed. Some branches do remain. And finally, very high severity stands. This is a photo taken in Waterton. They have ground surfaces composed entirely of mineral soil or ash, and 100% of the overstory tree canopy has been removed. So it's essentially a forest of blackened trunks with most branches having been removed from them. So few soil organisms and nutrients are likely to remain in these stands. And these are the areas where the most extreme ecological changes that I was mentioning earlier have taken place. So witnessing ecological renewal in burned areas of high and very high severity will take a lot more patience and openness on our part to witness than areas with that are affected by lower severity fire. So with that lesson in Fire Severity 101 in mind, let's take a look again at this map of the Kenow wildfire area that Scott has shown you. And I'm not sure where Scott went, but was he right there? He's hiding, that's okay. I do have copies of this map. They're actually not true to this color, so just keep aware of that, but Scott's going to pass them around here, so if you want to take a closer look at this, you can take this home with you. So this map shows the area of the Kenow wildfire, which you've all seen here already, as well as the severity of the fire. So the boundaries of the fire are shown, or of the Waterton Lakes National Park are shown by this white line. Here's the Continental Divide, and this is the Flathead area of BC, a little bit of Alberta affected in the Castle area and the private lands. So the total size of the fire, as Scott mentioned, was 35,000 hectares, or about 86,000 acres. And about 14,000 hectares was within BC, about 19,000 hectares within Waterton Lakes National Park, and then about 2,300 hectares were burned on private lands just outside of the park. And at the top of this map, you can probably see it better on your copies, which I'm glad you all have now. There's a legend there that describes fire severity, which you all now have had your 101 lesson in. So low severity is shown on the map by green, moderate severity through yellow, high severity is orange, and very high severity is red. And as mentioned, the maps that you've just been handed out aren't super great color. I think the toner was out on our printer, but as you can see here on this map on the screen, most of the area within the park was affected by very high severity fire, and actually approximately 44% of the park's vegetated area was affected by high severity or very high or high severity fire. So though there haven't been many in living memory, it's really important to keep in mind that Kenow was not the first wildfire to take place here. Prior to this becoming a full suppression national park, stand replacing fire was a regularly occurring process that took place on the landscape. And this is evident in this 1874 image of the Bear's Hump area, taken from the Prince of Wales Hotel. So this is among the first images ever taken in Waterton by the North American Boundary Commission. So this is the Bear's Hump. We're standing on Prince of Wales Hill. This is Emerald Bay, which looks very different now, and the Waterton town site's over here. And then this is Bertha Mountain, and you can see in the Akamina Valley, or Cameron Valley, and Bertha Mountain, as well as on Crandall Mountain, a lot of white, what look like sticks. So those are burnt trees that had burnt in fairly recent times when this photo was taken. And you can also see a lot of dark-colored regrowth taking place under the whitened trees. So this photo was actually taken by Rob Watt, who's in the room here, 135 years later in 2009 from the same place, a very different view there. And it shows really nicely there that in recent years prior to the Kenow wildfire, that evidence of the last stand replacing fire had really not been obvious. So it wasn't sort of within our living memories that a disturbance of that scale had occurred there and throughout much of Waterton Lakes National Park because of the significant regrowth that had taken place and because of the suppression that Scott was talking about earlier. So here is a third image that will be added to the historical record. This photo was taken in 2017, just shortly following the Kenow wildfire. And together these three images remind us that over the long term, wildfire effects on the landscape are more constant than they are not. The landscape is subject to a continual cycle of disturbance, such as floods and fires and disease and insect outbreaks, and then subsequent regrowth. And here's another example of that. So this image was taken in 1883 in the upper Blackiston Valley area. So South Kootenay Pass that Scott was referring to in his presentation is up in sort of the middle ground of the photo and the background there. And then this is the photographer's tent, which is looks kind of neat. And then lots, again, of white trees that were disturbed recently by fire, and a lot of dark-colored regrowth, especially on the mountain on the back on the left, that you can see had already started coming in. And then again, another repeat image. This photo was taken 126 years following that first one in 2009. And again, vegetation regrowth had taken place to the point where it was probably pretty difficult to go out there and find evidence of that last stand replacing fire. So it's really quite nice to have those photographs. And one more historical image here, taken in 1914, looking this time south from the Coppermine Creek area in the Red Rock Valley, or Blackiston Valley. So we're standing on the hill where Coppermine Creek is, and in the pass that you can see to the south there is where Crandall Lake is located, and sort of in the more closer to the foreground is where the modern day Crandall Campground is located. And again, this is the photographer's tent, conveniently located in the photo. And in this photo we can see here another fire had taken place, so another wildfire, and this one you can see especially quite patchy in nature, so lots of patches of trees that were left unburnt, and those patches are typically very important. They have very considerable influence in the recovery or the regrowth of a fire, or regrowth following a fire. So keep that in mind. And this is an aerial view of the same area not quite the same match, but this was taken in 2017 just following the Kenow wildfire. So here's Crandall Lake, and you can see the trail leading down from Crandall Lake toward Crandall Campground. And this photo shows that this fire has left very few patches of unburned or less severely burned vegetation. So really a good indication here of how the Kenow wildfire's widespread, high to very high severity with little patchiness was quite exceptional. Oh. Yes, so the question is, was this all burnt? Yeah, all this black is burned, yes. So you could see a small green patch of trees sort of in the foreground in the middle. But otherwise, yes, very well burnt forest. So let's look further now at how the park is looking now. This is a bird's eye view looking east along the lower Blackiston Valley. So you can see Crandall Campground there in the midground and the Red Rock Parkway that leads up to Red Rock Canyon. And as you can see here, with the exception of some apparently unburned trees along Blackiston Creek and near Crandall Campground, areas that were protected during the fire, most of the valley was burnt with high to very high severity. And here's an aerial view looking west along the Cameron Valley from the town site. We're sort of in a helicopter above the town site area, looking west again, or this time looking west, and you can see the Akamina Parkway here along the creek. Crandall Lake is here, and Crandall Lake is up around the corner. And again, from this photo, you can see most of this valley was burned with high to very high severity. And this photo, as well as the previous one, show that this fire affected all ecoregions of the park. So from the foothills parkland, or the grasslands down at the lower elevations, up through the montane, like we see here in this valley, up through the subalpine, and even into the alpine. Some alpine meadows were burned in this fire. So literally from peak to peak. So like you, that gives us an idea of what the park is looking like now, and like you, a lot of us are wondering in the park, what is the Waterton Lakes National Park going to look like, and how will it function into the future? So in order to get our best idea possible of this, we're looking to other wildfires that have occurred within the same ecosystem for examples of how ecological renewal has unfolded there. And you're likely familiar with some of those. I'll just run through a few. So this is the Sofa Mountain fire that took place in 1998 in Waterton Lakes National Park. And this photo was taken showing a portion of that burned area after 9 years of regrowth to 2007. So that's the closest example we have to look at. But there's also the Southern Porcupine Hills, or Granham fire, that took place in December of 1997, not far from here. And this image was taken just the following May, after just a few weeks of regrowth time. And then the Lost Creek fire took place in the Castle or Crow's Nest area in 2003. This image was taken 13 years after that fire in 2016, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And also several fires have taken place in Glacier National Park, Montana, such as this one at the Reynolds Creek in 2015, and this photo was taken just, again, after just a short amount of regrowth time the following year. So, as well as these examples of other burned areas, we've also, Parks Canada staff have met in January with several post-fire ecology experts from all over Western Canada and even the United States to help us gather ideas and information on research and monitoring that we should prioritize and support, as well as management actions that we may need to implement. And what we're hearing so far from those who have observed ecological renewal in other areas that have burned is very positive and encouraging. And what we've seen on the landscape since the Kenow wildfire is also encouraging. Signs of resilience became apparent just days after the ground had cooled. So here's an example of that near Red Rock Canyon. There were grasses resprouting at lower elevations. And at higher elevations, we've actually seen what we think may possibly be bare grass regrowth following the fire. And we're actually interested in, we're not totally sure about this, but this is a site that was affected by high to very high severity fire up there near the McNeely's picnic area in the Cameron Valley. And you can see some lodgepole pine cones. They're sort of in the middle of the photo. And these brown bits that seem quite out of place here now are bear grass. And we're thinking that they maybe had a stress response and pushed up a bit of growth following the fire. But we're looking forward to getting up there this spring and taking a closer look and determining whether that's actually the case. But some signs of maybe some life left up there. Actually, there's lots of life up there. So now let's explore how grasslands, forests, water bodies, and wildlife are expected to respond to the disturbance caused by the Kenow wildfire. So we'll start with the grasslands and the aspen forests. This photo was taken near the bison paddock looking southwest over the Eskering complex, or the Badlands, toward Red Rock Valley over here, and Waterton town sites over on the far left. So like higher elevations areas of the park, the grasslands burned with fairly uniform high to very high severity with little patchiness. And here's a closer look at grassland and aspen forest interfaces between high on the left and very high severity impacts near the Red Rock Parkway. We're looking west, right at the corner of Bellevue Mountain where the Red Rock Parkway travels. So we're expecting on the grasslands that we may see ready plant regrowth via resprouting of vegetative material underground that has not been damaged entirely by the fire. However, much of the seed bank that can be really vital to plant regrowth following a fire was likely damaged during the fire itself, or probably blown away following. We all know what the winds are like here, and it's been a very windy winter. So we've been working on a conservation and restoration project in Waterton aimed at reducing shrub and aspen cover on the grasslands using repeated low-intensity spring prescribed fires, and Scott and his team have been very successful in that over the last number of years. We've had a number of prescribed fires right here at this site and up the Red Rock Valley and the Wishbone area as well. So we're really interested now in examining whether sites such as this that were treated with prescribed fire prior to the Kenow wildfire, whether they burned any differently in this wildfire than sites that had not been treated with prescribed fire. So that may explain this interface that we see here in this photo. We'll take a closer look at that coming up here. So here's a look at an aspen forest in the Red Rock Valley. Aspen can show very highly competitive responses on burned sites, so we may see a lot of suckering in stands where the aspen weren't killed underground. So we'll continue to monitor aspen and grassland dynamics, and we may also resume those low-intensity spring prescribed burns in order to continue the fire cycle that historically has kept much of the grasslands area in the park free of shrub and aspen cover. So much of the area of the park, as you can imagine, has been affected by high and very high fire severity is vulnerable now, especially to invasions of non-native plants. And here's an example of a portion of the massive hawkweed infestation that's taken over in the Lost Creek area since that fire took place in 2003. We're really hoping that this isn't what Waterton Lakes National Park comes to look like in the coming years. So our extensive and very innovative non-native plant management program is poised and ready to respond to the breadth and depth of challenge that's posed by this unprecedented disturbance in the park. And in the short term, park staff and visitors, like all of us, may need to make adjustments to our activities in order to minimize non-native plant infestations or invasions. So let's move on now here to areas that we've known as coniferous forests. How do we anticipate that they'll fare in the coming years? This is a look again at the upper Blackiston Valley, similar to that photo I showed earlier with that tent in the foreground here. Slightly different view. So we're looking towards South Kootenay Pass there again. And we're expecting vegetation in these areas may also regenerate via resprouting from, again, undamaged material that's underground, maybe like that bear grass we saw earlier. And also regrowth here is probably going to rely a lot on seeds. And again, the seed bank is maybe not as present as under a lot of, or following a lot of fires in coniferous forests. There aren't a lot of patches. This image shows some patches where there's some canopy left on some trees. But a lot of, so some seeds may come from those canopies that are not damaged. Again, some may be in the ground, but we're also probably going to rely a lot on wind bringing seeds in from BC and Montana, as well as wildlife, birds, animals that bring seeds in their guts and drop them. So there will be probably a lot of regrowth of vegetation initiated by wildlife and wind. And this image shows burned and unburned forests on either side of the Continental Divide, looking south along Forum Ridge, with Cameron Valley on the left and Cameron Lake on the left, Forum Lake on the right. And pre-Kenow wildfire forests, as you see on the right there, really reflected environmental conditions that were present when those forests established following the last disturbance, following the last stand replacing fire or other disturbance that took place there. And precipitation volumes in the year or two following that disturbance would have played a really key role in laying that foundation for the forests that we see there now. So in areas that have been recently burned, as we see on the left side of that ridge there, with high to very high severity especially, we expect vegetation communities to establish in the coming years that reflect the climate and soil conditions that are taking place currently. So really quite a neat opportunity to see what starts. And from this we can expect that the distribution of vegetation in Waterton Lakes National Park that we've known to be potentially drastically altered. We may see grassland meadows and shrublands take place of some forests, or in some areas. So this image shows a subalpine forest in the Lynx Creek area of the Lost Creek fire that took place again in 2003. So this photo was taken 13 years later in 2016. And as you can see there's a lot of low growing vegetation, probably a lot of forbs and grasses. But the person that took this photo noted to me that he's walked through there looking for trees, and he'll walk along with his hands searching for trees under the vegetation, and maybe every couple hundred meters he'll come upon a little seedling of a tree. So really not a lot of trees regrowing there. And if a forest community is reestablishing there, it's happening exceedingly slowly. And this is quite consistent with a study that was completed in the United States just recently. Since 2000, 30% of sites there were burned were too dry and warm for forests to take hold. So 30% of sites since the year 2000, and prior to the year 2000, it was only 15% of those sites that were burned that were not seeing forests taking hold because of the conditions. So our drier and warmer climate is actually having an effect on forest regeneration following fire. So rather than view a forest such as this as dead or lost or destroyed, let's look at this as an opportunity to observe how nature responds to such an extreme disturbance, and also as a great opportunity to witness the really quite fascinating beginnings of whatever vegetation communities take shape under these current conditions. So some of you may have experienced yourselves this fall or heard about the great volumes of ash that were redistributed following the Kenow wildfire. So some days it really felt and looked as though you were in some more of the smoke that had been quite a constant through a lot of the summer. But it was great clouds of other material. So this is a big, almost a wall, several hundred feet tall, of material blowing out of the Blackstone Valley. This is taken looking north from Prince of Wales Hill on one of those 140 kilometer an hour wind days in the fall. And when you look closely at some of the areas where this material has accumulated, it's accumulated in sort of like dunes. It almost looks like sand dunes or snowdrifts, but it's this material. So some of it's about a foot deep in places. And as you can see, it's not just ash. It might look like it from a distance, but it's actually got a lot of dry, dead vegetation, in it and soil. A lot of soil has moved and ash. And maybe seeds. There may be viable non-native or native plant seeds in these accumulations, and our vegetation specialist has taken samples and he's going to send them off and see if there's anything viable in there. So these areas may be really fertile. There might be a lot growing here in these spots. In other areas where this material has moved away from, will not benefit as much from that ash, which can act as a fertilizer, and maybe seeds. So let's move on here now to water bodies. As you can imagine, large areas of the park, creeks and rivers, have lost the majority of their vegetation canopy that has shaded them. And one might expect then for water temperatures to increase as a result. However, they're not actually expected to shift that much from what we've heard, because a lot of our creeks are fed by groundwater. So temperatures in the creeks should stay relatively the same. But the extreme changes to the vegetation in those areas where overland flow feeds water bodies also are expected to result in altered water chemistry and quality. For example, really high volumes of sediment are likely to move into our water bodies for many, many years to come. And along with sediment often comes phosphorus. So phosphorus levels are expected to be elevated into the long term as well. And this will likely drive aquatic plant production in creeks. So the many colorful rocks in creeks that we often enjoy in these quite clear running creeks in the mountains will likely become darkened with algae, just small algae growing on the rocks. For quite some time in the Lost Creek drainage, creeks that were affected by the fire there are still looking like this 13 or 15 years later now. And similarly, more dramatic changes may also become visible. So again, the typically clear running streams may actually appear to become choked with larger algae like this for quite some time. And again, in Lost Creek, the same sort of algae is still present about 15 years later. So they may appear as though they're not terribly supportive of life because they seem so choked with algae, but they actually are still alive, and the communities will just shift, and the insect communities are expected to change and probably have a lot more disturbance tolerant species in there, such as flies, hopefully not biting flies. And with the changes in the aquatic insect community, we'll probably have changes affecting fish, so such as trout, like bull trout, for example. I guess often they are seen to grow less following a large disturbance like this, and there may be other impacts on them as well. We'll maybe take a look at that. So moving here on to wildlife, and this is the last segment of my talk. So the Kenow wildfire's rapid growth and extreme behavior led to some direct mortality of wildlife during and following the fire. Helicopter and ground patrols by Parks Canada wildlife specialists and other staff in the days immediately following the fire recorded at least 40 large mammals that had died, either due to smoke inhalation or other reasons during the fire. So it was about 15 deer, 6 elk, 7 moose, 7 black bears, and 4 unknown species that were recorded during that time. And as you can see here, animals that perished in the fire were promptly consumed by others that remain and provided really important resources for them following such a large disturbance. A lot of bears probably were quite happy. They were already in typically pretty good shape before the wildfire happened. However, most large mammals that were observed in the days following the fire were alive and appeared to be healthy, such as this bull elk. And also such as this black bear that was captured on a remote wildlife camera descending that Alderson Trail just 10 days following the fire. Looks pretty healthy. So the fire did have short-term impacts on individual animals, but regional populations do remain intact and will recover from this disturbance. So in the days following the fire, some bears were seen feeding on trout that had been killed, likely by the heat of the fire, in Cameron Creek. So this photo was taken along Cameron Creek. As you can see, the fire burned right up to the creek bank, so the shallow water at that time of year would have been pretty warm, and trout are very sensitive to temperatures. So there were a lot of dead trout, and a lot of bears took advantage of that, of course, like they do. So in the coming years, bears are facing quite a large-scale removal of berry-producing plants that they rely on so heavily, and we may see them concentrate in areas that are still supporting berry and root crops. So it's extra important for humans to make sure that we minimize opportunities for them to access unnatural attractants. But we can expect berry bushes to regrow in a few years' time, and when they do, for there to be significant berry crops for them to enjoy and take advantage of. So as many of us have seen firsthand, bears are among the most resourceful and resilient wildlife on the landscape. And this sow black bear showed us a really excellent example of that. So I showed you another photo earlier of taken from a remote wildlife camera, and we have quite a number of remote wildlife cameras up in the park for wildlife study purposes. And prior to the fire, like Scott mentioned, we made a lot of preparations knowing that it was coming, and that included in that was removing most of our remote wildlife cameras because they're quite valuable, and we wanted to be able to use them following the fire. So we took down most of them. This camera we left up. So these photos, this first set of photos was taken well prior to the fire. So 2 years prior, in September of 2015. I had just put this camera up, and I didn't realize that this tree in the foreground was a rub tree, and this was the first bear, I think, that showed up on it. And we know her as Bear 14. She's got an ear tag because she was handled a couple of years ago. She's a good bear, you'd say. She coexists really well with humans around the Wateron town site. She's raised a cub there already. So this year she didn't have a cub, but she walked down the trail. She sniffed the tree, and you can see the ear tag in her ear there. And then she gave a really good rub on the tree, which was pretty neat. And then, following the fire, this was just 2 days after the fire on September 13th, she came walking down the trail again, and you can see the charred areas in the photo. She sniffed the tree again, and again she rubbed on it, like virtually the same pattern. So again, sort of a neat example of how resilient wildlife can be. And just to give you a bit more insight into that site, I have a short video to play, time lapse of all the photos that were collected on that camera during the fire and just shortly before. So can everybody read this, what it says? I'll read it out loud then, so you can... So it says, each frame shows the date, time, and temperature at the top. And this is available online if anyone wants to look at it. So mule deer passed through just a few days before the fire, and then a skunk just hours before the fire arrived in the area. So this is about 11 o'clock on September 11th. And Cameron Creek is to the left, where the sparks are all coming up from, just above Cameron Falls. So watch the temperature on the top right. It's at 40 degrees Celsius right now. 48 degrees. So this is about midnight. 57 degrees, yeah. 58 degrees was the maximum temperature just after midnight. And there's that black bear, number 14, and a cougar just a couple days after the fire. Fire crew, and deer as well. That's it. So like I said, you can access that online if you want to look at it again or show your friends. We were pretty excited when we walked up to that camera and saw that the fire had been right there, and the fire was untouched. It was amazing. The tree was black, but the camera wasn't melted or anything. Pretty neat tools. Okay. I'm getting close to the end. Thank you all for your patience. I'll share just a few more examples of wildlife's resilience to the Kenow wildfire before I conclude. So Scott mentioned this earlier about the bison being evacuated or taken out of the bison paddock. Bison are really well adapted to surviving wildfire, and we did have a team of experts come in from Grasslands National Park, and they were able to load up almost all the bison. This one bull that you can see in this photo here next to this pond was a bit stubborn. He decided to stay and wait out whatever was coming. And the fire did move through the paddock, as you can see here. And this lone bull must have survived just by standing in one of the big ponds there. It would have been quite an experience. And he was shipped off following the fire to the Piikani Nation, and the other members of the herd were in grasslands for a while, and I believe they're now moved on to Riding Mountain National Park. And the plan is to rest the bison paddock for up to a couple of years, 2 or 3 years maybe, depending on how things regrow, before any animals were put back. Along similar lines to cattle on the ranch lands. So other ungulates such as moose and deer and bighorn sheep have been observed in burned areas, moving between and foraging in islands of unburned habitat. So there's a moose moving through a pretty heavily affected forest. And my dad, I should just mention, my dad loves this photo. He thinks I should send it to Robert Bateman and get him to paint it. He'd love the light on there. I might just do that. It's not my photo though. And then elk. The regional elk was observed rutting on the Blakiston Fan, much like as they always do every year, just in the weeks following the fire. And over the winter, though, the herd had lost a lot of its winter range, so they were seen spending some time in areas that they aren't typically in large groups, including outside the park and looking at people's hay and other grass that was intact. But it's expected that after some regrowth, even just this spring, I've heard that actually there's a lot of regrowth happening just in the last few days, that they'll be back into their normal range, probably in short order. Small wildlife species such as ruffed grouse and red squirrels have really surprised us with their presence in heavily burned forests last fall. And even positive signs that other really small animals such as snakes also survived the fire. A lot of animals that were able to go underground seemed to have survived. And in the coming years, keep on the lookout for woodpeckers such as this three-toed woodpecker and the black-backed woodpecker. They're both disturbance-oriented woodpeckers that come in following a fire and show up en masse looking at the insects that colonize burned forests. So they're pretty rare around Waterton usually because we haven't had a lot of large fires, but we're expecting them to maybe show up in large volumes here. So some park staff made the unusual observation of a young western meadowlark, which is a grassland species, at the Little Prairie picnic site in the Cameron Valley this past fall, just a couple of weeks following the fire. So not a bird you would typically expect to see in the subalpine forest. So this little bird provided a good reminder to us to be open-minded and to expect the unexpected. So in summary, let's just review quickly those 3 key messages that I presented earlier, that extreme ecological changes have taken place following the Kenow wildfire, that ecological renewal will take place, and that ecological renewal may take some time, and the results will likely be very different than what we've become accustomed to. Some areas may appear to be dead, but they're not. They've just changed quite drastically from what we've known. So this is a very interesting time to be part of this landscape and this precipitation. We have a lot of snow right now. So the snow and other rain events that take place this spring and summer and next year too will lay the foundations for ecological renewal that takes place in the park over the coming years. And we'll have a lot of questions probably start to be answered this year, this spring and summer, and then we'll have more questions as we go. And I encourage you all to share your observations with us. If you're in the park and you see something Nate or that you want to know more about, please find some park staff and let us know or ask your questions. We're all going to be in it together, learning and observing here. And together we look forward to witnessing how post-fire renewal unfolds in Waterton. So thank you very much for your time and interest tonight.